Hi, everyone. I have Les with us. Welcome, Les. Thank you for joining me on Yachting International Radio.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Just to give a bit of background on how we met in jail, we weren't in custody serving time per se, but we were actually doing our therapeutic treatments in jail, where we offered our services to the inmates at the time, the men in custody. And Les' background is he's from Meth Anonymous, is that right? And Recovery Australia or Sydney?
Yeah, use crystal meth anonymous. Under the 12 steps, I don't speak for them. I speak for me, a normal person.
Yes.
But I won't speak for Sydney Recovery and Exodus Foundation where I work.
Okay, fantastic. So can you tell us a bit about meth? Because from my experience working with the prisoners, I've obviously seen the effects firsthand. And I've also been told by a client that we both know, Miles, who said that it was like claws going into you and it doesn't let go. It's just got such a deep hold onto you.
Yeah, I think we all have different experience. Mine was, I'd been a millionaire. I was living in Perth at the time. I had 10 years clean time prior to that. I had a chain of ladies' boutiques in Perth and a steel import business. When GST came in, I lost a lot. Ended up going bankrupt. I went bankrupt for $1.5 million, which is mainly paper money through shopping centre leases. But I also lost a house in PG in Perth, a 4-bedroom house with a heated swimming pool, and I ended up on the streets. I went back to my normal job as an electrician. I couldn't really succeed at that. But in the meantime, I ran into a young girl who used to shop in my shops. She was using crystal meth and I decided I'd have a go. I was 49 at the time. I'd never injected before in my life. And I did. I picked it up and I ran with it for about 6 or 7 years.
Wow. So what happened to your life around you once you started using?
I had a psychologist once in jail said that I hated the world and I hated everyone myself. And that was probably true. I didn't really care. I'd given up on society. I thought society had given up on me because I'd had a lot of losses. Losing my business, I also lost my last partner and a young child. I had a lot of kids. I had 6 kids to a lot of different women. But anyway, that's another story. But I lost a lot, ended up on my own. Crystal meth, I was starting to have a breathing problem at the time. I got emphysema. Crystal meth seemed to improve my breathing, gave me insight. I ran into someone that was a dealer in Perth who we had common friends in Sydney. He was from Sydney. So we had an arrangement. I'd drive him around overnight and he'd give me free meth. In Sydney, it's more ice, but in Perth, it was called crystal meth at the time. And I suddenly had friends again, probably on the wrong side of the tracks. But in my life, I had met people on the, for want of better words, the dark side. And I used business principles that I didn't buy off the street dealer. I bought off the suppliers. I bought off the cooks. Yeah. And it gave me a world to fit into. And I didn't suffer psychosis to a huge degree that a lot of people do. I didn't walk down the street any different to what I do now. Probably I walk a bit slower now, that's about all. But I didn't walk with arms and legs like a lot of ice users. Yeah, because ice is expensive. We pay more in Australia for ice than anywhere else in the world. So the profit margins are huge. But it led me into crime to pay for it. I ended up working for a triad family in Sydney. I worked for 2 of them and then federal police put a stop to all that. I'd never been to jail before. I ended up doing 18 months for 90 charges of fraud. And when I got out in 2009 was the last time I used ice. I haven't used it since.
Yeah. So what intervention strategy did you have in place? Because it's very difficult just to go cold turkey on it.
I've got now 7 years of total drug and alcohol free, and that's through choice. It's nothing else. But I'd met along the way a psychologist in Sydney, Carlos, and I rang him up and I said, he knew me from an alias when I was on the run from the police in Sydney in a homeless men's shelter. And I told him I wanted to get clean. He said, fine. We put a date together, which was 16th of January. He then said to me which detox to go to. I went to that. He then told me to go to a rehab called Foundation House, which I did. And he also was associated with a halfway program called Burke Street. And I went there for 9 months. And in that time, I learned to find me. I started to get rid of the stigma associated with being a drug user, someone who lost everything, come homeless, been to jail. And in starting to love me, I was able to embrace my life for the good and bad that it's been. And things came back into my life. I've been overseas twice. I just got dumped by a lady in Hong Kong, but I regained relationships. My kids are back. I've got 6 kids, 13 grandkids, half a dozen great-grandkids. All bar one of them are in my life.
Wow.
I'm responsible now. In part of my job at Exodus, I sometimes have to get the police and they'll say, what's your name? Because I'm the reporting person.
Yeah.
And I think I've been looked up more times than anyone else. But I don't have any, I tell them, when you look me up, I've got pull. But this is who I am now. And that's all that matters. So in my job, I try and help other people to face the realities of their life. And then that helps get rid of the stigma associated with whatever problem you've got.
Yeah. So I know with working with the prisoners, there's a lot of shame and guilt, and it's like the cycle of abuse. And then you use more to cover the shame and guilt, and then you feel more shame and guilt. And it's just this ongoing pattern that you immerse yourself in. If someone's, and also with the cycle of change, you need to have an awareness that you need to change as well as a willingness to change. So got the awareness and willingness, but you don't know where to begin. What would your suggestion be?
I asked a prisoner a couple of weeks ago that I was helping. I said, has anyone really asked you what you want to be in your life? And he sat back and he said, well, I did a fork truck driver's license in jail. And I said, yeah, but I can't see you being a fork truck driver. The guy was quite intelligent. Not that fork truck drivers aren't intelligent, but I just thought there was more to this man. He's in his late 40s, early 50s. He'd never been asked since school what he wanted to be. And I went back to school after I got clean. I went back and did Cert 3, 4 and diploma in community service. And people were amazed that I went back later in life. And I keep telling people that there's no beginning and end to when you could go and get retrained or become who you want to be. There's no pathway. There's people that suffer mental health, the same thing. We had one guy that used to come and see me at Exodus. He was suffering severe depression. And I said to him one day, I said, half of your problems would probably go away if you've got a job. And he said, that might help. A bit of money in my pocket. And I said, yeah, a bit of money in your pocket gives you back some dignity. You don't become wanting us to give you a takeaway meal every Sunday. Anyway, he over a period of time, he went and got a job. Turned out his father was quite well off. And his father, while this person was suffering mental health, was quite willing to leave this gentleman run his own race. When he saw that his son was actually getting his life back together and had got a job and was living in a boarding house, his father then bought him a unit in Canberra. The guy then came and see me and he said, you won't see me again. I'm moving to Canberra. My dad's bought me a unit because I'm having a go. And I've never seen that guy since. And that was over 12 months ago. So I assume he's doing all right. And all he needed was a little bit of support and a little bit of guidance.
Yeah. But I know it was just so common, especially working with men. And obviously when you're working in jail, you're dealing and fighting against a code, a particular cultural code, which is you don't show your emotions, you don't become vulnerable, and you don't ask for help. So we're trying to encourage them to do everything that's abnormal to their way of life. And from your experience being male and having had those experiences, how does a man push those boundaries and fight the ego associated with asking for help?
I think it's when one man tells his story in an honest, non-dramatical way. I don't tell my story to prisoners or to anyone to say what a good guy I am. I just tell my story as this was my life. I think that empowers someone else. I had an example. I was abused sexually when I was a young teenager. I'd never talk about that to anyone because I didn't want to be tagged as gay or whatever, because I wasn't. I was abused by two males. I heard another man who I respected talk about the sexual abuse he did in jail. When he did, that gave me permission to tell my story.
Yes.
Because he wasn't judged. I didn't judge him. I didn't treat him any different after he told that story. But because he told me his story, I was able to then tell my story.
Yes. And I think that's the power of talking. And when you're in a group and you're assessing that's safe and you know that whatever is said in the room stays in the room, then it allows you to open up and accept yourself and accept others. And it normalizes the behavioral experiences that people went through in their past.
Yeah, and that goes with ISIS, especially with the ads ran on TV where it demonizes a drug. Sure, there are some people who suffer some very severe effects from their use of ice. I don't discount that. But there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who recreational use ice weekends or whatever, who don't have that happen to them.
Oh, so that's what I find fascinating, because I know the prisoners tell me like their lawyers that come in and see them, they're on ice, the doctors are on ice, and the functioning ice addicts, but because it's such an addictive drug, I'm just amazed on how you can not spiral out of control.
One of the night, you probably remember from your time in Sydney, Oxford Street on a Friday, Saturday nights full of people partying. Most of those are semi-professional. Most of those will use ice or if not some type of amphetamine, coke or whatever to give them a boost for the night out.
Yeah.
And then Monday they go back to work and they live a normal life.
Yeah.
It attracted me. It hooked me. I didn't really realize how bad I was hooked until I was in Surrey Hills lockup and I knew I was facing time.
Yeah.
And I knew that I had to detox. There's also something that's jail talk, but when you're arrested, you look for an excuse why you did what you did. And one of them is either play the mental health card, that I'm mentally ill. The other is play the junkie card. The drugs made me do it. I never played any of those cards. I just took responsibility for what I did. It's my choice that I picked up. I did what I did. No one made me. The drug didn't make me. I did. So there is two sides. And I think I've sat with prisoners when in the yard and also outside where they'll talk about the drug made me do it, or I'd be normal if I didn't take this. Sadly, there's not enough rehab beds in Sydney or in New South Wales or probably in Australia. So if someone wants to, if I have anyone, an ex-prisoner, a prisoner, whatever, comes to see me at work and says, I want to get off of ice. First off, because of the stigma associated with it, everyone thinks there's a tendency that the person will turn violent. I was never violent, so I don't know where that can be with everyone. I don't think I was the exception. And I didn't mix with a lot of violent ones either that were on ice. So for me to get them into a rehab or detox first is hard because I'll have to get some type of mental assessment done on them. Their past criminal record will be looked at to see whether there's any violence charges. They then might get into a detox after a 2 or 3 week wait, which along the way, most addicts will then turn around and say, it's not that bad. I don't really want to give up my best friend, so I'll keep using. Mm-hmm. If I get them into detox, then to get them to be able to go to a rehab straight from detox is like trying to win lotto.
I know.
It just doesn't happen. I waited 2 weeks between detox to get into rehab, but I had the support of a psychologist. Not everyone has that. So they drop off. It becomes too hard.
Yeah.
Even with private health insurance, it's not a walk-in, walk-out situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And also it's become quite a money-making scheme. I know when I was in Fort Lauderdale, there's massive ice problems. There are people dying literally on the streets, and the rehabs are charging them an utter fortune. So then it leaves them maybe somewhat clean but insignificant debt. And are helpful. So that's why I left New South Wales to work in Victoria in a facility that had all the resources in jail. So universities, as well, TAFE, we call it in Australia, and the hospital, everything was inside the jail so we could better support them so they don't fall through the gaps. Yeah. But what I saw in Melbourne was so many young kids. I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe the amount of late teens and early 20-year-olds. I didn't see that in New South Wales, but it was mostly children in jail. It was terrible. Adolescents.
We still have the same problem here. And then they go to juvenile facilities with a drug problem that's not treated. They then progress to an adult facility where they learn new tricks along the way. It's just sad. And then the system, we're privatising our jails now. So we're using a lot of, I've got to be careful what I say, but I think that the private institutions needed to employ social workers. Most of the skilled ones were with corrective services. Now they're getting younger social workers work for them who are straight out of uni, and their knowledge is book-based. It's not experience-based. It's sad. And so we think we're doing the right thing. We're supposed to, when we put people in jail, it's not just punishment. It's supposed to be rehabilitation. And that seems to be a dirty word now.
Yeah. Very sad.
Yeah, and the recidivist rate in Sydney, it's still, in New South Wales, it's still 80% will reoffend in the first year. So it's cheaper to, we argue with the government that it's cheaper to put someone into a private rehab, even at $30,000 for 28 days, which is what they charge in Sydney, than it is to put them in jail. Because to put them in jail, it's $100,000 a year.
Yeah, that's right.
Yet you could have sent them to rehab, and we're associated with a rehab in Thailand, 5-star accommodation, $13,000 for 28 days, including your airfare, which is cheaper than Sydney's based ones, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then the free ones, the likes of Who's Foundation House, William Booth, the list is a mile long. And then if they've got mental health problems, if they're coming off of methadone, there's very limited places they can go to. If they're using benzos, Toral, Valium, Xanax is a big problem in Sydney at the moment, especially with mentally ill. We've still got doctors writing scripts like it's confetti, and yet the Medical Association doesn't agree with that. Yeah, when you look at how many people are using, how much benzos are being used in Sydney, it's just ridiculous.
Why do you think benzos? What? Why are they?
Valium, Celopax, Xanax.
But why? Why do you think this is the latest trend at the moment?
They're cheap. With Xanax, you get a similar effect to what ice does. They'll go into a form of psychosis. You forget who you are. You become someone else. And most drug addiction is for that. You don't want to face up to who you are. You want life to be different. So the drug masks that.
So I know within our industry, the choice of drugs is cocaine, alcohol, and I believe heroin, especially in the Caribbean, because it's easily accessible. And maybe a lot of people watching this interview go, meth, I don't do that. My drug is more superior, like cocaine. It's a different class of drug. What would you say to someone who has that mentality?
In Perth, coke's very limited. In Sydney, that's still quite a big market. It's still more of the A-listers. Most of them don't realise that on the street, cocaine's in Sydney's only about 20 to 30% pure if they're lucky. The rest of it's S26 or baby's milk. They don't usually get brown rock or beige rock. So a cheaper alternative and more readily available alternative is ice. The rush from coke, when I used it, I'd be lucky if it lasted 20 minutes, whereas the rush from ice can last a couple of hours. So it depends what you're looking for and the drug you're taking. Both of them will keep you awake all night, which is probably why people take them anyway. That exhilaration effect. We still got a comeback of heroin on its way back. We didn't suffer the same as Melbourne with, forget the wrong, the patch that they get stronger from. That was killing. We haven't had that really hit Sydney. The heroin still has got a subtle market that seems to always be there.
Yeah.
But the big money maker, ice still sells from $350 to $500 a gram. Coke sells for $300 to $400 a gram, mainly because it's cut so much. They're both imported. They're both a lot cheaper overseas than what they are in Australia. So the profit margins are huge, and that's why the government keeps putting up the record catches they make at the airports and at the docks. We've not had a drought of any drug in Sydney for as long as I can remember.
Wow.
When I grew up, if the cops I was a marijuana smoker as a teenager and took acid and things like that. If the cops made a big bust on marijuana, there'd be a drought. Don't have droughts anymore. So the amount coming in must be considerable.
Yes, absolutely. So,
and I don't think you have droughts in Perth either, do you?
Yeah, I'm sure you can get drugs everywhere. So I was like, never heard of being able to get your hands on it. But in terms of young kids using cocaine and how you said that it's cut with other drugs, do you know what exactly the type of chemicals that are in there?
They're usually cut with baby's milk. S26 is a problem.
Something when you said baby's milk, I was like, I thought it was literally something else.
No, the powdered one. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I've had 80% pure Coke, and that's very rare in Sydney. Very rare.
Gosh.
Most of it's cut because of the hands that it goes through to get. It comes from Colombia to get it to Australia. There's a lot of people paid off along the way. It's an expensive product.
Yeah.
And because of the reverse stigmas, ICE has got this stigma that it'll send you into psychosis, that you'll become a complete mess. Coke's still the opposite. Coke is all the A-listers use it, so I can kid myself. I'm a celebrity too. Exactly. It's got a better reputation, even though the results are the same. Yeah, so there's that illusion where reverse stigmas between drugs. I even heard a counsellor the other day, and it made me sick. He was talking about the difference between alcoholics and heroin users, and he called one bedwetters and the others bag snatchers. And I thought, and you work in this industry, and I'm sorry to say he's based in Melbourne where you work. That mentality's still there amongst people in the industry.
Yeah.
Even with people on ice, when I have them come to my clinic on weekends and I can tell they're strung out. Yeah, I remind them they need to sleep. I used to go 2 weeks without sleeping and go into a twilight zone. Most probably couldn't handle that, but you forget when you're on ice that you need to sleep, you need to eat. Basic hygiene can go out the window as well. You tend to exist for the drug, which is probably what Miles was talking about more than anything. And because it's so expensive, unless you're in a really well-paid job, most Joe Blows in the street, if they've got an ice addiction or a cocaine addiction, tend to either have to sell drugs to supply their habit or do crime. Well, they're doing crime selling it as well. But then you start mixing with the undesirables of the world and you go from respectability to that other world.
Yeah. And for me, what was astonishing in jail was, I think maybe Miles told me that when you get medicated by the nurses in the jail, whether it's with methadone or whether they're smuggling in drugs, they would then consume it, swallow it, and then vomit it up and strain it through a sock and then sell it.
Yeah. The butyl they do that with. And then they can smoke that. Yeah, there was no. And then we talked before about they made tobacco and other illegal substances within jails. It's just silly. They also, when I was in there, I was offered methadone, and yet I'm not a heroin addict. I was offered Seroquel because it tends to knock people out. So I didn't use any substances in there. Years ago in New South Wales, when we had a corrupt minister running it, Rex Jackson, They used to allow drugs into jails because they thought prisoners were more controllable when they were on substance. So where we try and stamp out illegal substances going in there, we give them legal ones for the same result.
Yeah.
So that they're more controllable.
Yeah.
And they're coming out of jail. They went in on a lower dose of methadone. We get them presenting at Exodus when they've come out on huge doses of methadone. So to get them back to normality or to wean them off is a right process. You can't just jump off of 100 mils of methadone a day to nothing in 5 minutes.
No, you can't.
So who pays along the way?
Yeah.
What it's become too hard and then the person goes back to using. I've got people that live near me that are on methadone and still use heroin. It's the methadone is basically for the days when they can't afford to buy heroin.
That's it. Yeah.
Yes.
It's very tragic. And I commend you and thank you for all the work that you're doing and serving the community. I know it's not easy, especially when you don't feel supported by the government and when the system fails us. It's very hard to do that because I've been there and it burnt me out so many times. So thank you so much, Les, for what you do.
Even in this year, towards the end of last year, I had to go and identify a dead body with my boss alongside. This was a man that when we tracked down his family, they hadn't seen him for 10 years. They knew him as a violent alcoholic. We knew him as a gentle soul who was just lost in the system. And he died of a heart attack and exposure on the front steps of the place alongside where we were. When we identified him, he was just another number to everyone. When we had a Memorial Day at Exodus for him, we had nearly 100 people turn up. We knew this guy really well. But the difference between when his family knew him and his son to what we knew him of, and there was a 10-year gap. And this man had just slipped through the cracks, and he was only in his late 40s, early 50s. So it was another wasted life.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the previous part of his life, but the death was a waste.
Yes.
He should have lived on to his 70s, 80s and been productive.
Yeah.
He used to bring me food until I found out he was getting it from a garbage bin. And then but he was that type of guy. And we get addicts like that, or that one guy, he's got severe drug addiction and mental health problems. He goes back to a trauma where his wife, he was married, he was separated from his wife. He had 2 young kids. They were going to meet up in Sydney. They were driving down from Queensland. They had a car accident just outside of Newcastle. His wife and 2 kids died in the car accident.
Right.
He's been a mess ever since, and that's over 20 years. So no one's ever treated him for the trauma, the losses he had in his life. And now he lives doctor shopping, and he's a heroin addict as well. He's on methadone. All he needs is that longer-term care. I had a lady come the other day. She's in a private rehab. She's 9 months pregnant, battling addiction. She came to see us wanting clothing and stuff for her newborn baby when it pops out. And this lady was due to pop the baby at any stage. Yeah. And yet she's in a rehab. I know it was her choice to use. And when I talked to her, she'd been through, I named some of the rehabs and places she could go to when she got out of where she was. And she'd been through them all before. She was not just the new one that had just had an accident. She'd been through the system. So how the system had failed her along the way, or she failed in the system, only God knows the answer to that. But we gave her a lot of stuff, and this woman had nothing. And she's only a young girl, late 20s, early 30s. So what life is in store for her?
Yeah.
And there'll be the stigma of, I'd no doubt there's mental health problems there. There's probably some post-traumatic stress from along the way. A lot of women, if they get mixed up into the drug world or the crime world, have faced rape along the way. A lot of young men, the same thing. We don't have male prostitution as on show as what it used to be, but it's still there. And the same with female prostitution. Now that we've semi-legalized, or it's legal in most places, it's gone off the streets to into parlors, so the problem's hidden. And most of them there are either forced into it or are there because they're financing a substance or a mental health problem, which is sad.
Yeah.
There's no beds for homeless. There's a lot less beds in Sydney for homeless women than what there are for men, because we assume that a man will take you home, and if they don't take you home, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they tend to sleep on the country platform at Central. It's just sad. Or a woman will hitch on to a bloke purely for safety.
Yeah.
Not through love doesn't come into it. It's basic animal survival techniques coming into it.
Like you just sharing these stories, I know that, I don't know if you remember February, who he also died. And he was in our group for a very long time. Such a talented man, a talented hip hop dancer, artist, a kind soul. He was a street kid from Indonesia and again had a tough life. And I think what prison taught me is the true meaning of being non-judgmental towards people and accept them for who they are. And I encourage the community not to judge people for how they're presenting, but have that empathy and compassion to understand why they are the way they are so that you can help them.
Yeah. And Bev was even in death, his faith I've got to be careful what I say. The religion he followed, because he was if he died from suicide, they were prepared to bury him.
Yes.
Because he died of drug addiction, then that they were going to Austria, and they wouldn't have buried him. He wouldn't have been allowed to be buried where he was. So his family would have wore that stigma. I know Reverend Bill that I work for became involved, and so did someone in corrective services in the Justice Department, in making sure that Fed was given the burial he deserved. And that was sad. There's a memorial at Parkley in that back section for February, and a couple of other guys that have died.
Yeah,
Tim that runs that section, still is one of the best hearts that I've met in corrective services. He can be tough when needed, but he also understood drug addiction and mental health.
Yes.
And there's not enough people like that. Your colleagues at the time, Angela, Denise, Denise now is the head psychologist there. Angela's been moved on to running groups elsewhere. I had a young social worker from one of the outer Sydney jails. I won't identify her, but she rang me and didn't understand about the stigma that even when a prisoner's released, he's given a black garbage bag with his belongings in it, half a check, and if he's got clothing, otherwise he goes out and breathes. And then we wonder why he reoffends. We're putting him out. We asked in a meeting we had with corrective services a couple of weeks ago, we said, with all the charities or with all the money that you've got, couldn't you afford to at least give the guys a backpack on the way out if they've got nothing, and then make sure that they got clothing, even if they might have got bail, Supreme Court bail, and there's no warning that they're coming out. So the guy gets let out of Goulburn. He's based in Sydney with a half a check, a bus ticket back to where he was arrested from, and said, good luck if he's lucky. Or usually the screws said to me when I was released, Bantam, when you come back, let us know you're a good prisoner. We'll get you work again. And I said, I'm not coming back. But they expected me to go through the revolving doors again.
Yes.
And that mentality, sadly, is still there.
Yeah. I remember even not only are they given the right support when they leave, but some of them are in the institution for so long that so many things change with technology, with the own card, they freak out. And I think Blake.
Yeah, I know Blake, yeah.
He did the idea of going into Coles and getting potatoes for his mother, and he couldn't do it because he didn't understand how the system worked and freaked out.
Most of them, I've taken guys from jail, they've never bought a week's shopping. They live day to day. When you say to them, you learn to budget or whatever, they don't know what you're talking about because they've lived for years on an idea, fantasy of whatever crime you're doing, that it'll never end. And if I find $2,000 today, I'll get $2,000 tomorrow. Then when they come out and they're on a Centrelink New Start benefit or a DSP or whatever, to budget then and to do things like you're talking about, buy an Opal card, put prepaid credit on their phone because you've got to stay connected. The government's now pushing with my Gov accounts and all the rest of it that they need to be computer literate. Yeah. And we've still got a big percentage of prisoners who can't read or write. they pretend they can.
Yeah.
You saw that, Corinne.
Yeah.
I used to read for a pair of brothers that used to pretend to read a letter, and you could watch their eyes. They weren't reading.
No.
And I said, and it was letters from their mum. So I used to, and I had to do that in secret, read them their letters, because they didn't want the stigma attached with it that they couldn't read or write. So they would sign documents that from lawyers or whatever, they just didn't have a clue. And we still allow that to go on. The New South Wales system just got rid of a lot of remedial teachers from the jail system. They've probably done the same in other states as well, because if you want to cut costs, what it is, you don't cut it on security, which I understand. So you cut it on the auxiliary staff, whether it's social workers, teachers, whatever. There's still a attitude within corrective services that if an officer really wants to help prisoners, he gets the term criminal lover, which is another stigma. So he gets ostracized amongst his own profession.
Yeah.
And that goes on. They say it doesn't, but it does. I know that when I was in there, if you requested something, you filled out what was called a bluey. And as I'd submit it, I could hear the shredder going as I walked away, because the system was, just because I asked for it now doesn't mean I get it put through. I can ask 2 or 3 times and then maybe get it put through. Yeah. So that mentality builds at us and them.
Yeah.
Mentality that grows stronger and stronger. Where do we put a stop to it? When do we?
By talking about it and exposing these behaviors.
Yeah. And you're trying to make a difference. We're trying to make a difference. We're not the do-gooder sitting on a fence that lives in Chatswood or Leafy, Scarborough, and that doesn't want so-called criminals coming near their homes. We don't, when someone comes to us for help, and I'm sure when they go to you for help, you don't ask their address and say, oh no, you're from Rockingham, I'd rather deal with people from Subiaco or Claremont. No, we don't, at Astra, we don't say that you live in Mount Druitt or Darling Point or Edgecliff. We treat the person as a person, and I think we need to do more of that. Treat people as people rather than their address, their bank account, their colour, their skin, their religion, whatever.
Yeah, or their history or their mental health illness. Yeah, all of that.
Yeah, what you were yesterday doesn't mean that's what you are today or what you need to be tomorrow.
Yes, exactly right.
And so we all go through CBT training and that, but I think a lot of professionals forget what that is. Sounds good. I'm a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy expert, but I won't apply that anywhere, or I won't really apply it to my patients because they might get well.
Yes.
I'll end on even the stupid thing the government's done now with, and it exists in your state as well, to get on the DSP, you need to have a report from, if it's a mental health issue, you need to have a report from a clinical psychologist. How many the government then gives out free 10 visits a year to a psychologist. We've seen clients come to us that have been knocked back for DSP because the psychologist that they thought could write them a report was not a clinical psychologist. That psychologist knew that what they were doing would not help the client. But because they got 10 visits paid for by the government, they went along, and then at the end of it, they'd say, oh yeah, I'll give you a report. Or no, you need to really see a clinical one, and that will cost you. The person on Yacht, how do they afford the $200 to go see a clinical one?
That's right. See, that's
a muddle through the cracks one.
Very frustrating.
And with people in the industry, that's what gets me. That I did ones for some people last year. One lady had been through 2 lots of the 10 visits and had an application and an appeal put in, which had no chance of being successful because there was no clinical psychologist attached to it. And if the clinicians before me had bothered to even look at the criteria for DSP, they would have seen that. You can't mention drug and alcohol and mental health with a client applying for DSP because the government will turn around and say, well, get better. They don't say how they'll get better. They just say they'll get better. So that person that's had long-term substance use mixed with a mental health issue stays on Yacht, tends to then gravitate to crime, to support themselves, and then goes back to the corrective services, which is wrong.
And
So
what's pathetic is that it's costing the government so much money. There's only a few significant tweaks that they need to do, and they would be saving our community. They would be saving taxpayers' money, and it just makes no sense.
the right wingers of this world that seem to be running everything now saying, lock them up. We've just had the sad thing of bushfires all over the place. One of the right wing radio stations before we were speaking was talking about how they should be given 15, 20 years. We forgot there's a mental health issue called kleptomania. Not normal people don't go out lighting fires. You might get the odd idiot that lights one to see the effect, but there are people with mental health issues that then come out. We're not talking about helping them. We're talking about locking them up now for 15 to 20 years. Does that really solve anything other than making the person in the leafy suburb feel good that we've acted, we've locked them up?
Yeah.
And sadly, though, what people, the right wingers forget is no matter who you lock up and how long they get out. And if we haven't corrected the problems they had before they went in, they will come out and repeat the same things again.
Exactly.
Maybe in a worse way. So that's but it'd be great to catch up when you come to Sydney.
Yes, I'll definitely send you a message, and thank you so much for your time and sharing your insight, knowledge, experience. Much appreciated by us all.